They mocked Malik Thompson's blood and turned the young black man away in front of everyone. The whispers were cruel. Some blood should never mix. But seconds later, the hospital doors exploded open as the mayor's daughter was rushed in, dying from massive blood loss. The courtroom of judgment flipped in an instant. The only blood that could save her was the same blood they had just rejected. The man they humiliated now held her life in his veins. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The new mayor's promise. Charleston, South Carolina, woke beneath a gray autumn sky, the kind that held a soft chill in the air and left the streets shining from an early dawn mist. Church steeples stood over narrow roads, harbor winds moved through the old brick buildings, and campaign banners still fluttered from lampposts as if the election had ended only an hour ago. By 8 o'clock, the front steps of Charleston General Hospital were crowded with reporters, city staff, volunteers, and curious residents. At the center of it all stood Mayor Jonathan Whitmore, a 58-year-old white American politician with carefully combed silver hair, sharp blue-gray eyes, and the polished posture of a man who had spent most of his adult life standing behind podiums. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and always dressed as if a camera might be waiting around the corner. This morning he wore a navy overcoat over a dark suit, his jaw clean-shaven, his expression solemn in exactly the way the public liked from men in power. Jonathan had built his career on speeches about order, dignity, and civic responsibility. People called him charming. His opponents called him calculating. The truth, as even his allies knew, lived somewhere in the uncomfortable space between both. He stepped toward the microphones as camera flashes sparked across the hospital entrance. No citizen, he declared, his voice firm and measured, should die because our city failed to keep enough blood on its shelves. A murmur of approval moved through the crowd. Behind him hung a fresh white banner printed with blue letters. Charleston Cares. Citywide Blood Drive. Jonathan lifted one hand, as if presenting a promise to the city itself. This is not about politics, it is not about headlines. It is about neighbors saving neighbors. Churches, schools, firefighters, local businesses, students, retirees, we are calling on all of Charleston to step forward. If you are healthy enough to give, then today you can become the reason someone else gets to go home. The applause came quickly. It rolled across the square in warm waves. Some people clapped because they believed him. Some clapped because everyone else did. Several members of the press wrote down his line about neighbors saving neighbors. It would sound excellent on television. A few steps behind the mayor stood Rachel Dunn, his communications director, a 40-year-old woman with auburn hair pinned tightly at the back of her head and a practical, watchful face that rarely softened in public. She was slim, brisk in movement, and known inside City Hall for seeing weakness before others even sensed it. Rachel approved of Jonathan's message because it was clean, visual, and effective. A blood drive made him look compassionate without requiring a long legislative battle. In her mind, good politics was not separate from good optics. The two were twins. A little farther back stood hospital staff in pale scrubs, including Nurse Emily Carter, a 31-year-old white woman with blonde hair twisted into a precise bun, fair skin, and light hazel eyes that often looked sharper than they meant to. Emily was neither warm nor cold at first glance. She had the efficient posture of someone trained to move quickly, listen selectively, and hide exhaustion beneath professionalism. She had grown up in a small South Carolina town where people spoke politely in public and poisonously in private. Her late father, a stern mechanic who believed hardness was wisdom, had raised her on suspicion disguised as caution. He had distrusted almost everyone outside his own narrow circle, and though Emily had spent years becoming educated, disciplined, and respectable, some of those old voices had remained in her longer than she liked to admit. She had never thought of herself as cruel, but there were biases in her that she rarely examined, because they had arrived in her life wearing the clothes of normalcy. As applause rose again, Emily clapped too, though more softly than the others. She looked at the mayor, then at the hospital doors, then back at the waiting cameras. Somewhere beneath her professional calm was the uneasy thought that charity always looked easiest from the outside. Across town, far from the polished marble of Charleston General, Malik Thompson was finishing the last hour of his morning shift at a shipping warehouse near the harbor. Malik was 24 years old, an African-American man with a tall, athletic frame built less by vanity than by labor and discipline. He stood a little over 6'3", with deep brown skin, a strong jawline, broad shoulders, and close-cropped black hair that he trimmed himself every other Sunday. His dark eyes were steady and observant, the kind that seemed to listen before he spoke. He did not carry himself like a man trying to impress anyone. He carried himself like someone who had learned early that dignity must often be protected quietly. Malik's co-workers liked him because he never complained first, never bragged, and never left another man to finish a heavy job alone. He lived in a modest apartment above a laundromat on Line Street, paid his bills on time, rose before sunrise to run along the waterfront 3 mornings a week, and avoided the drinking culture that swallowed many of the younger men he knew. He ate simply, kept his kitchen clean, and called his grandmother every Sunday after church. People described him with words like solid, respectful, dependable. But underneath that calm exterior lived a grief he carried carefully, as if sudden movement might break it open again. He lifted the last crate off a pallet and set it down with practiced ease. Sweat darkened the back of his faded charcoal work shirt. Nearby, an old radio perched on a shelf above the tool cabinet crackled through static before a local news anchor's voice sharpened into clarity. Newly elected Mayor Jonathan Whitmore today launched Charleston Cares, a citywide blood donation campaign in partnership with Charleston General Hospital. Malik paused, one hand still on the crate. His friend and co-worker Terrence Cole, a 26-year-old black man with a stockier build, warm brown skin, a trimmed beard, and the easy humor of someone who made hard work feel lighter, let out a whistle. "Man, look at that," Terrence said. "Mayor already out here trying to be everybody's hero." Malik smiled faintly. "Maybe somebody gets helped," he said. Terrence glanced at him. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Malik wiped his hands on a rag. "If they're taking donors, yeah?" Terrence nodded. He knew why before Malik said another word. Years earlier, when Malik was just 16, his mother had been injured in a highway collision in Georgia while traveling home from a nursing shift. Her name had been Denise Thompson, a 42-year-old woman remembered by everyone who knew her as graceful under pressure, soft-spoken in ordinary life, and unshakably fierce when it came to protecting her son. She had been medium height, slender, with tired, kind eyes and short natural curls she kept wrapped in scarves on workdays. Denise believed in 2 things with almost religious certainty: that education could open locked doors, and that bitterness could ruin the soul of a good person. After the accident, she had reached the hospital alive, but there had been delays. Too much blood lost. Not enough supply ready in time. Malik never forgot the phone call, the hollow wait, the way adults around him kept using careful words that changed nothing. That loss had not made him angry in the loud way people expected. It had made him disciplined. Later, during a routine physical, Malik learned he carried one of the rarest blood types in the region. The nurse who told him had said, half-joking, "You're 1 in a million." But the phrase stayed with him for a different reason. If his blood was rare, then one day it might be the difference between life and death for someone else. Since then, he had quietly promised himself that if he was ever healthy enough, available enough, and needed enough, he would never say no. Back at the hospital, the announcement wrapped up to another round of applause. Jonathan Whitmore stepped down from the podium and shook hands with donors already lined up inside the lobby for photographs. He knew how to hold a handshake just long enough to look sincere, yet even as he smiled, his phone vibrated in his coat pocket with a message from his daughter. "Landing early. Don't send anyone. Need to talk. Sophia." He looked at the screen only for a moment before locking it again. His daughter, Sophia Whitmore, was 22 years old, a white American college student with chestnut blonde hair, thoughtful green eyes, and a face that carried more intelligence than vanity. She had inherited her father's height and poise, but not his comfort with performance. Slim, composed, and usually dressed more simply than the daughters of powerful men were expected to, Sophia studied public health in Boston and had spent the past 2 years becoming increasingly skeptical of anything that looked charitable only when cameras were present. As a child, she had adored her father. As an adult, she had started noticing which parts of him appeared most clearly when the public was watching. That had not made her stop loving him. It had only made love more difficult. At nearly the same hour, a black sedan pulled quietly to the curb outside the Whitmore residence. Sophia stepped out with a canvas duffel bag over one shoulder, thanked the driver, and stood for a moment looking at the house she had grown up in. She had not told the press she was coming home. She had not even told her father the whole truth about why she arrived early. In her bag, tucked between textbooks and a sweater, was a folder of copied financial records tied to contracts connected to the new city campaign. She did not yet know whether the blood drive was a pure act of compassion or another polished machine built to feed public approval, but she intended to find out. Elsewhere, in a modest white house outside the city, Emily Carter sat at her mother's kitchen table before heading into the afternoon shift. Linda Carter, a 60-year-old white woman with a narrow frame, dyed light brown hair, and the brittle politeness of someone who wore judgment like perfume, slid a mug of coffee toward her daughter. "You working that donation event today?" Linda asked. Emily nodded. "Hospital's full, they want everyone moving fast." Linda stirred sugar into her own cup. "Well, fast is fine, careful is better." Emily did not respond immediately. Her mother lowered her voice as if sharing wisdom rather than prejudice. "You know what I mean? These big public drives bring in all kinds. You just be selective." The room went very still. Emily looked down into her coffee. Some part of her hated these conversations. Another part had heard versions of them all her life until they no longer shocked her the way they should have. "It's screening protocol, Mom," she said at last. "That's how we decide." Linda gave a thin smile. "Protocol doesn't catch everything." Emily stood, picked up her keys, and said she would be late if she didn't leave now. On the drive to work, her mother's words stayed with her longer than she wanted. By evening, Charleston had fully embraced the mayor's campaign. Grocery stores displayed flyers. Church bulletins mentioned the drive. Local cafes offered discount coupons to anyone who donated. On social media, residents praised the city for coming together. The mayor's office released photos of smiling volunteers and hospital staff beneath the campaign banner. At his apartment, Malik stepped inside with tired legs and a quieter kind of energy than he had carried that morning. The place was small but orderly. A second-hand couch, a narrow kitchen, framed photographs on top of the refrigerator, and a magnet holding utility reminders near the freezer door. One of the photos showed his mother laughing in a blue nurse's uniform. Another showed Malik at 12, serious-faced and skinny, holding a fishing pole twice his size. He opened the fridge, reached for a carton of eggs, then stopped. For a moment, he stood looking at the blank square on the calendar clipped under a magnet. Then he took out a black marker. On the date of the city blood drive, he wrote in careful block letters, "Donate." He capped the marker and stepped back. There was no audience, no applause, no camera, only a quiet kitchen, the hum of an old refrigerator, and a promise made years ago to a woman who never got the blood she needed. Malik looked once at his mother's photograph. "If I can help somebody," he said softly, "I'm going." Outside, the harbor wind moved through Charleston's darkening streets. Above the city, campaign banners still fluttered beneath the streetlights, and somewhere far away, ambition, doubt, prejudice, and compassion were already beginning to move toward one another. They had not collided yet, but they would. The quiet refusal. By late morning, Charleston General Hospital no longer looked like the calm stone building that had framed Mayor Whitmore's speech the day before. The lobby had transformed into a carefully choreographed wave of civic energy. Folding tables lined the entrance hall, white banners with blue campaign lettering hung above the registration desks, and volunteers moved in coordinated paths carrying clipboards, juice boxes, crackers, and small paper bags filled with cookies. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, coffee, and the sweet artificial fruit scent of donated juice pouches. A long line of residents curved from the main lobby past the elevators and almost to the outpatient wing, a visible symbol of the city's enthusiasm. At the end of that line stood Malik Thompson, freshly showered, wearing dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal hoodie under a light jacket. His broad shoulders and calm expression made him stand out without trying. He held his completed medical history form in one hand, every answer filled in with careful block letters. He had slept lightly the night before, not from anxiety but from a sense of purpose. For him, this day had already become personal long before he entered the hospital. The memory of his mother's absence had stayed with him through breakfast, through the drive downtown, through every step he took toward the line. A few people ahead of him, an elderly white man with a cane, glanced back and offered a polite nod. Malik returned it with the same quiet respect he gave everyone. Around him, people chatted about church drives, office challenges, and who had convinced whom to come. A pair of firefighters joked near the snack table. 2 college students took selfies under the campaign banner. It was the kind of public charity moment cities love to celebrate. At the refreshment station near the far side of the lobby stood Sophia Whitmore, now dressed in a simple cream sweater, fitted jeans, and white sneakers that made her look more like a graduate student than the mayor's daughter. Her chestnut blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and the thoughtful seriousness in her green eyes made her appear older than 22. Unlike the polished smiles of some volunteers, Sophia moved with genuine attentiveness, checking that older donors had water, offering cookies to nervous first-timers, and quietly observing the system around her. She had chosen this position deliberately. From here she could see the line, the registration desk, and the screening stations beyond the frosted glass doors. The more she watched, the more she noticed how carefully curated the public image of the event felt. The front of the lobby was bright, warm, and celebratory. But the farther donors moved into the process, the quieter and less visible everything became. At the main screening desk sat Nurse Emily Carter, posture straight, pale blue scrubs perfectly pressed, blonde hair pinned into the same immaculate bun as the day before. Her hands moved efficiently across files and forms, but there was a stiffness in her expression that had not been there during the press event. Her mother's words from the previous morning had lingered in the corners of her thoughts, unwelcome but persistent. Emily prided herself on being rational, on trusting procedure, on never letting emotions interfere with professional judgment. Yet what she had inherited from her upbringing did not always arrive as obvious cruelty. Sometimes it arrived as hesitation, sometimes as caution, sometimes as the small pause before making a decision that should have been simple. The line moved steadily. One by one, donors approached, signed, answered brief questions, and were directed toward screening rooms. Then Malik reached the desk. For a moment, Emily looked up only out of habit. Her eyes met his, then dropped to the form in his hand. She took it, scanned the answers, and then saw the typed blood type from his previous medical record attached to the file transfer from a local clinic. AB negative, rare, valuable. Her gaze flicked briefly toward him again. Malik stood straight, calm, respectful, with the composed confidence of someone who had every reason to believe he belonged in that line. Then something in Emily faltered. It was not a dramatic reaction, no visible hostility, no sharpness in tone, only the smallest hesitation, the kind that might go unnoticed by almost anyone else. But Sophia, watching from across the room, saw it. Emily's polite smile thinned. She glanced over Malik's shoulder at the line still stretching behind him, then back at the chart, then toward the open donation wing where several chairs remained empty. "I'm sorry," she said softly, almost apologetically. "We've already met our target for today." The words landed with deceptive gentleness. Malik blinked once, certain he had misheard. Behind him, the line still curved through the lobby. More people were still entering from the front doors. A volunteer near the entrance was actively handing out new forms. He looked past Emily toward the open wing. There were clearly still available stations, but years of protecting his dignity had taught him the cost of challenging humiliation in public. Sometimes defending yourself only gave cruelty a larger audience. So Malik gave a slow nod. "All right," he said quietly. His voice held no accusation, which somehow made the moment heavier. He stepped aside, careful not to disturb the people behind him, and moved away from the desk with the controlled posture of a man refusing to let anyone watch him break. Across the lobby, Sophia's hand tightened around the tray of juice boxes she was carrying. That made no sense. The line was open. The drive was still active. No official cut-off announcement had been made. As Malik walked toward the side hallway leading to the exit, Sophia noticed Emily's face. It was not triumph. It was discomfort. Shame flickered there for half a second before professionalism sealed it away again. That was when Sophia's suspicion sharpened into something colder. Near the registration desk, two middle-aged women waiting in line leaned toward each other, believing their voices too soft to carry. "Better safe than sorry," one murmured. The other gave a tight nod. "You don't know where that blood has been." A third voice, male this time, added in a whisper edged with smug certainty, "Some people just aren't ideal donors." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Malik heard every one of them. Each syllable struck with the hard chill of something old and familiar. Not surprising enough to shock, but painful enough to wound all the same. He kept walking, past the framed hospital awards, past the children's mural near pediatrics, past the bright posters thanking Charleston for its generosity. By the time he reached the side exit corridor, the weight in his chest felt heavier than any crate he had lifted at the harbor. At the refreshment station, Sophia set down her tray and quietly handed her post to another volunteer. That volunteer was Grace Miller, a 19-year-old nursing student with freckles, auburn curls tucked beneath a volunteer cap, and the open sincerity of someone not yet old enough to hide what she thought. Grace had joined the event because her older brother survived leukemia after dozens of transfusions, an experience that had made her almost reverent toward blood donors. She noticed Sophia's sudden tension immediately. "Everything okay?" Grace asked. Sophia forced a small smile. "Just need to check something." She followed the direction Malik had gone, though she stopped short of fully leaving her station. She did not want to make a scene, not yet, but she watched him disappear down the corridor with the unmistakable bearing of a man carrying humiliation in silence. Back at the desk, Emily continued processing the next donor. A retired teacher, a grocery store cashier, a firefighter. Her hands remained steady, but her mind did not. She knew the explanation she had given Malik was false. The target had not been reached. The event still had hours to run. Multiple chairs were open, so why had she done it? The answer was not simple enough to fit into one word. Part of it was her mother's voice from that morning. Part of it was the low murmur of assumptions she had heard all her life. Part of it was the ugly comfort of inherited bias dressed up as caution, and part of it, perhaps the part that disturbed her most, was how automatic it had felt, not hatred, just reflex, which she realized with growing unease might be worse. In the hallway near the side exit, Malik paused beside a vending machine and exhaled slowly. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but only because he had spent years mastering the art of appearing unaffected. He thought of his mother, of the promise on the fridge, of how foolish it suddenly felt to have believed this citywide message of unity applied equally to everyone. Still, he said nothing. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and walked out into the cool Charleston afternoon, where harbor winds swept fallen leaves across the hospital steps. Behind him, inside the lobby, the blood drive continued with smiling volunteers, flashing campaign logos, and the polished illusion of shared humanity. But for Malik, the city's promise had already cracked. And for Sophia Whitmore, standing silently near the refreshment station with growing suspicion in her chest, the first fracture in her father's perfect campaign had just become impossible to ignore. The emergency upstairs. Malik had just stepped beyond the glass doors of Charleston General when the world behind him shattered into motion. The cool harbor wind that had met him on the steps was suddenly cut by the piercing scream of emergency alarms from inside the hospital. At first, it was only a sound, sharp, metallic, urgent, but within seconds it was followed by movement so chaotic it made everyone near the entrance turn. 2 paramedics burst through the automatic doors pushing a trauma gurney at full speed. The young woman on it was barely visible beneath soaked blankets and the frantic hands of the medical team. But the dark red spreading across the white sheets said enough. One of the paramedics, Luis Moreno, a 34-year-old Latino man with a powerful runner's build, close-shaved dark hair, and the focused calm of someone who had spent 10 years making life-and-death decisions in seconds, barked updates as he ran. Luis had once lost his younger sister in a delayed emergency transfer, a wound that had turned him into one of the fastest trauma responders in Charleston. He did not waste words unless they mattered. Female 22, high-speed collision, severe abdominal trauma, major blood loss, BP crashing. The wheels rattled violently over the lobby tiles as nurses and doctors cleared a path. Another paramedic, Hannah Pierce, a 29-year-old white woman with a lean frame, sharp cheekbones and red hair tucked beneath a Navy trauma cap, pressed gauze harder against the patient's side. Her voice stayed level, but urgency tightened every syllable. "She lost more blood at the scene than we estimated. We're almost out of time." Malik froze on the hospital steps. People in the lobby, who moments earlier had been chatting over juice boxes and cookies, now stepped backward in stunned silence as the cheerful blood drive atmosphere collapsed into real emergency medicine. The ER doors burst open from the trauma corridor. A resident physician shouted toward the blood bank station, "Massive trauma upstairs. We need AB negative now." The words hit Malik like a physical force. AB negative, his blood type. Inside the blood bank office, Harold Finch, a 56-year-old white technician with thinning gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the permanently tense expression of a man who had spent decades managing shortages no one noticed until it was too late, stared at the inventory screen in disbelief. Harold was known in the hospital as meticulous to the point of obsession, a habit born from the year he had once miscoded a platelet shipment and nearly cost a child her surgery. Since then, he trusted numbers more than people. He typed rapidly, checked again, and felt his stomach drop. Only one compatible unit remained in storage. Not enough for catastrophic trauma. "Call Berkeley County," Harold snapped to the junior lab assistant beside him. "And Savannah Memorial. Anybody with helicopter transport." The assistant grabbed the phone, but everyone in that room already understood the truth. Sophia might not have that kind of time. Near the lobby elevator, Mayor Jonathan Whitmore stormed in with 2 aides trailing helplessly behind him. Gone was the polished composure from the hospital speech. His silver hair was wind-tossed, his tie loosened, and his face looked older by 10 years than it had that morning. The confidence that cameras usually drew out of him had vanished, replaced by the raw panic of a father who had received the one phone call power could not soften. "What happened?" he demanded. Rachel Dunn, his communications director, hurried to meet him, her usual control cracking at the edges. "Single vehicle crash on the Cooper River Bridge," she said. "The road was slick from the rain. Her SUV hit the guardrail." Jonathan's eyes widened. "She was supposed to be at the house." Rachel hesitated. "She left before anyone could stop her." What Rachel did not yet say aloud, but already feared, was why Sophia had been driving so urgently through the storm. Earlier that afternoon, Sophia had been alone in the Whitmore residence study, going through the campaign folders she had secretly brought from Boston. She had always been intelligent, but what set her apart was persistence. Once something troubled her conscience, she could not leave it alone. Inside the records, she had found invoices that did not match the scale of the blood drive. Media spending, consulting fees, image management contracts, social amplification purchases. Thousands of dollars disguised as community outreach support. One company name appeared repeatedly, Harbor Light Media Strategies, a sleek Charleston public relations firm run by Victor Langston, a 47-year-old white executive known for immaculate suits, expensive watches, and the kind of smile that never reached his pale gray eyes. Victor had built a career making politicians appear compassionate whether they were or not. Years earlier, his own father's failed Senate campaign had taught him a brutal lesson. Perception wins before truth arrives. Since then, he had treated public morality like a product to package. Sophia had recognized immediately what the invoices meant. The blood drive was real. But someone inside the campaign had inflated the optics budget, using charity as a vehicle for media manipulation. She had taken the copied files, climbed into her black SUV, and driven into the rain to confront someone at City Hall before the records could disappear. She never made it there. Now, upstairs in Trauma Room 3, doctors cut away blood-soaked fabric while machines screamed warnings into the sterile air. The trauma surgeon on duty, Dr. Daniel Hayes, a 45-year-old African-American physician with deep brown skin, calm, commanding eyes, and the unshakable steadiness of a man who had spent 20 years between chaos and survival, assessed the damage in seconds. Daniel had become a surgeon after losing his younger cousin to an ER delay in Detroit, and every major trauma since had carried the quiet echo of that old helplessness. He looked at the monitor, then at the blood loss estimate. "She won't survive without immediate replacement," he said flatly. A nurse answered, "Only one AB negative left." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Get it started. Keep calling every county within flight range." Downstairs, Jonathan stood near the elevator, one hand pressed against the wall for balance. For the first time in years, the machinery of politics had become meaningless. Poll numbers, campaign messaging, headlines, speeches, none of it mattered against the image of his daughter on a trauma table. Then another thought hit him harder. The blood drive, the image campaign, the money, the contracts. For the first time, Jonathan wondered if Sophia had discovered what he had chosen not to look at too closely. Had he let ambition build something false around something good? Had he cared more about what compassion looked like than what it truly was? The moral crisis cut through him with brutal clarity. Not because he had orchestrated cruelty himself, but because he had benefited from systems he had not questioned. At the hospital entrance, Malik had stopped halfway down the steps. The shouted words still echoed in his ears. AB negative. His pulse quickened. He looked back through the glass doors into the hospital he had just left, humiliated. For one suspended second, pain argued with conscience. Then the gurney imagery flashed in his mind, the blood, the urgency, the possibility that someone upstairs was about to lose a mother, a daughter, a future. His hand tightened at his side. Whatever had happened at the desk no longer mattered as much as what was happening now. He turned sharply. Inside, the lobby had transformed from civic celebration to crisis zone. Volunteers were being ushered aside. Staff moved at a sprint. The blood drive line had dissolved into anxious clusters of people whispering updates. From the trauma corridor, another desperate voice rang out. "We're running out of time." Malik's breathing steadied into decision. He knew exactly what that blood type meant. He knew exactly what the shortage meant. And he knew exactly what promise he had written on his fridge. Without another thought, he ran back and through the hospital doors toward the trauma wing, every step carrying him deeper into the collision between prejudice, politics, and the humanity that now depended on him. The chapter closes with Malik reaching the trauma corridor entrance, eyes fixed ahead, as the hospital races against the clock for Sophia Whitmore's life. The blood they rejected. Malik reached the trauma corridor breathless, the sharp scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of panic filling the air. The cheerful hospital atmosphere from the blood drive downstairs had vanished completely here. Everything beyond the double doors moved with the controlled violence of emergency medicine. Stretchers rolling, nurses calling vitals, monitors pulsing in relentless rhythm. The bright overhead lights flattened every face into urgency. At the nurse station just outside Trauma Room 3, Emily Carter was updating the emergency intake log when she looked up and saw him. For a moment, time seemed to split. Malik stood there, chest rising and falling hard from the run back through the hospital, rain-speckled jacket half open. dark eyes locked with a calm intensity that made the surrounding chaos blur. "I'm AB negative," he said, voice low but absolute. "Test me now." Emily's fingers went still above the keyboard. The weight of what she had done downstairs rushed back with brutal force. Only minutes earlier she had looked at this same man's form, hesitated, and quietly removed him from the line. Now the same blood she had denied was the one thing standing between life and death for the mayor's daughter. Her throat tightened. For one naked second, all the inherited caution, the old phrases from her mother, the shadows of her late father's voice collided head-on with reality. Her father, Thomas Carter, had been a hard-faced white mechanic with thick hands, oil-stained fingernails, and the rigid worldview of a man shaped by bitterness and old Southern divisions. He had died 5 years earlier from a heart attack in his garage. Still clutching the chest pain he insisted was nothing. Thomas had taught Emily discipline, punctuality, and the belief that the world was dangerous because some people made it that way. As a child, Emily had absorbed those lessons without examining them. In nursing school, she had learned science, ethics, and procedure, but the emotional reflexes built in childhood had never fully disappeared. She hated that she could feel them now, cracking under the shame of undeniable truth. Before she could answer, the trauma doors swung open. Dr. Daniel Hayes stepped out with surgical gloves half pulled onto his hands, his calm, dark eyes immediately reading the scene. Tall, composed, and powerfully self-controlled, Daniel carried the kind of presence that made panic reorganize itself into order. When his gaze landed on Malik, recognition flashed. "You're Malik Thompson," he said. Malik nodded, surprised. Daniel gave the smallest, almost disbelieving breath of recognition. "Community Center, East Charleston. 3 summers ago. Youth basketball fundraiser." The memory returned in a quick flash. Malik had volunteered as a coach for neighborhood teenagers during a summer violence prevention program. Daniel had sponsored the medical outreach tent beside the gym, offering free physicals and hydration clinics for the kids. What Daniel remembered most wasn't Malik's jump shot. It was the way the younger boys followed him, not out of fear, but respect. Malik had stayed late after every game to talk one troubled 14-year-old out of gang recruitment. Daniel had noticed then what he noticed now. The young man carried steadiness in a way few people did. "We don't have time to waste," Daniel said, turning to Emily. "Run rapid screening now." Emily moved instantly this time, shame sharpening her efficiency. "This way." The rapid donor room was smaller than the public screening wing downstairs, stripped of ceremony and reduced to essentials. Blood pressure monitor, hemoglobin strip tests, typing confirmation kit, sterile trays. Malik sat without hesitation and rolled up his sleeve. A new supporting nurse entered to assist Nina Brooks, a 27-year-old black nurse practitioner with warm brown skin, short natural curls, and the composed empathy of someone who had once survived sickle cell complications as a teenager. That history had made her deeply protective of blood access systems and quietly intolerant of anything that interfered with them. She read the urgency in the room immediately. "Fingerstick first," Nina said gently. The process moved in near silence. Blood pressure stable, pulse elevated but safe. Hemoglobin excellent. Rapid infectious screen clear. Type confirmation, AB negative. Perfect. Daniel looked at the final strip and nodded once. "Clear him." Within minutes, Malik was in the emergency donor chair, reclining under bright white lights with a thick line already placed into the vein in his arm. The collection bag hung below the chair, empty for only a moment. Then the blood began to flow. Dark. Steady. Silent. The room around him blurred into quiet machinery. For Malik, the sight carried an emotional gravity far beyond medicine. This was the promise he had made in his kitchen. The vow born years earlier from the helplessness of losing his mother. But unlike the grief of that memory, this moment held purpose. He was no longer outside the system, denied and dismissed. His body itself had become the bridge between cruelty and survival. Through the observation glass, Emily stood frozen. The collection bag slowly filled with the very thing she had doubted less than an hour earlier. Each ounce of blood felt like a verdict. Not against procedure, against her. She remembered her father once refusing to let a black neighbor help him after a storm damaged their roof, even though the man had been the only one who showed up. Emily had been 14. She had watched the neighbor leave quietly, ladder still balanced on his shoulder, and had heard her father mutter something about pride and boundaries. At the time, she had accepted it as ordinary. Now, watching Malik's blood fill the bag that would save Sophia Whitmore, she finally understood how cruelty often disguised itself as normalcy until crisis stripped away the lie. Behind her, hurried footsteps approached. Mayor Jonathan Whitmore emerged from the elevator corridor with Rachel Dunn beside him, his face pale and hollowed by fear. "Doctor," he called when Daniel stepped into the hallway with the first full unit. "Tell me she has what she needs." Daniel's gaze held steady. "She has a fighting chance now." Jonathan looked at the blood bag, then at the donor room through the observation window. His breath caught. Inside the chair sat the same tall young black man he vaguely remembered seeing near the registration line earlier that day during the photo opportunity. Rachel's expression shifted first, understanding the implication before Jonathan spoke it aloud. "That's the donor?" she asked quietly. Daniel did not soften the truth. "Yes, the same donor who was turned away downstairs." The words struck Jonathan harder than any political accusation ever had. He stared through the glass at Malik, calm, composed, giving life to the daughter whose campaign image had helped create the environment that humiliated him. Jonathan's throat tightened. This was no longer merely a father's crisis, it was a moral indictment. He thought of the polished speeches, the campaign slogans, the banners declaring unity, and the reality that the one man truly embodying that message had been quietly excluded until tragedy forced honesty. In the donor chair, Malik remained still as the second-line transfer team rushed the blood toward Trauma Room 3. He did not ask whose life he was saving. He did not ask for gratitude. He did not even ask whether the people who rejected him now understood the irony. That was what made the moment unbearable for those watching. Not anger. Grace. As the bag reached its required volume, Nina carefully adjusted the line and gave Malik a look of deep respect. "You came back anyway," she said softly. Malik looked toward the trauma doors where staff disappeared with the blood. "My mother didn't get the chance this girl's getting," he replied. "That's reason enough." Outside the donor room, Emily lowered her eyes, unable to escape the cruel absurdity. The blood she had doubted. The blood she had denied. The blood she had been taught, in quiet, inherited ways, to fear. It was now the only thing keeping Sophia Whitmore alive. The chapter closes on the image of the full-blood bag disappearing through the trauma doors, Emily standing in silent shame behind the glass, and Jonathan Whitmore staring at Malik with the first true understanding that compassion and dignity had arrived from the very man his system had failed. Truth beside the hospital bed. The red surgery in progress. Light above Trauma Room 3 finally went dark just after sunset. For nearly 2 hours, Charleston General had lived inside a suspended breath. The once busy donation event downstairs had been quietly dismantled, the banners still hanging in the lobby now feeling strangely hollow compared to the real act of sacrifice that had just taken place beyond the trauma doors. Nurses moved more softly. Voices dropped. Even the fluorescent lights along the ICU corridor seemed colder, sharper, as if the building itself understood how close it had come to tragedy. When the doors finally opened, Dr. Daniel Hayes stepped out first, surgical cap removed, short black curls damp with sweat, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. His posture remained controlled, but exhaustion now sat visibly on his shoulders. Years in trauma medicine had taught him never to celebrate too early, yet there was relief in the way he exhaled before speaking. "She made it through surgery." The words struck the corridor like warmth after frost. Mayor Jonathan Whitmore, who had been standing rigidly near the ICU window with one hand pressed against the glass, closed his eyes for a long second. The polished politician was gone entirely now. His silver hair had fallen out of place. His shirt collar hung loose, and his face carried the stunned emptiness of a father who had already imagined the worst. "Will she recover?" he asked, voice rough. Daniel gave a measured nod. "She lost a dangerous amount of blood, but the transfusion stabilized her in time. The next 24 hours matter, but she has a real chance." Jonathan swallowed hard. For several seconds, he simply stood there in silence, looking past Daniel toward the ICU doors where his daughter had disappeared. Around him, aides, hospital staff, and Rachel Dunn all instinctively gave him space. Then Daniel added more quietly, "The donor's blood made the difference." Jonathan turned. He already knew who Daniel meant, but hearing it spoken in this corridor, outside surgery, outside campaign optics, outside performance, made it land with greater force. Daniel met his eyes steadily. It was Malik Thompson. For the first time in Jonathan Whitmore's long political life, there was no prepared response, no speechwriter, no campaign instinct, no strategic phrasing. Only silence. The truth hit him with humiliating clarity. The city's most authentic act of compassion had come from the very man his own hospital system had failed downstairs. Jonathan nodded once, almost numbly, then turned and walked toward the donor recovery wing. The room where Malik Thompson rested was smaller and quieter than the ICU corridor. A soft monitor beeped beside the reclining chair where he sat, one sleeve rolled up, a juice box untouched on the tray table. His broad shoulders still held the physical strength that had made him stand out in the donation line, but there was a visible fatigue in the way he leaned back now. His face remained calm, though paler than before, his dark eyes focused on nothing in particular as he recovered from the rapid donation. Jonathan stopped in the doorway. For years he had entered rooms like this with certainty. He always knew the correct tone, the right smile, the angle that transformed sincerity into leadership. Now he felt almost unsure how to stand. Malik looked up first. For a brief second, neither man spoke. Then Jonathan stepped forward slowly, hands open at his sides, no podium between them, no cameras to catch the expression on his face. "You saved my daughter." The sentence came out stripped of all public polish. "Just a father." Malik held his gaze, then gave the smallest nod. "I saved a life," he said quietly. "That's all." The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than accusation ever could. Jonathan looked away for a moment, shame rising beneath the relief. Political guilt had always been abstract to him before, numbers, narratives, compromises, but this was different. This was personal, immediate, human. His campaign had built a citywide message around unity. Yet the system surrounding that message had still allowed humiliation, exclusion, and prejudice to operate beneath the surface. And the man most wronged by it had chosen mercy over resentment. That contrast sat in Jonathan's chest like a weight. At the far end of the corridor, unseen by both men at first, Emily Carter had paused beside the supply cabinet with a chart in her hands. She had not meant to overhear the conversation, but once she heard Jonathan's words, "You saved my daughter," she could not move. The scene before her broke something open inside. Malik was not bitter, not triumphant, not even angry. He had simply done what was right. The moral distance between his grace and her earlier refusal became unbearable. Emily lowered the chart to her side, her fingers trembling. The voice of her late father, once so certain in her memory, now sounded small and ugly compared to the reality unfolding in front of her. She stepped backward into the empty medication room and closed the door behind her. For the first time in years, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, collapsing grief born from shame, self-recognition, and the realization that prejudice had lived inside her longest where she had least wanted to look. Upstairs in the ICU, Sophia Whitmore lay motionless beneath soft blue blankets, her chest rising in fragile rhythm under the machines. The bruising along her temple had darkened, and a line of stitches traced near her hairline, but the sharp intelligence that defined her had not been dimmed. Near midnight her eyelids fluttered. A nurse at her bedside, Claire Benson, a 50-year-old ICU veteran with short, silver-blonde hair, calm blue eyes, and the deeply practiced tenderness of someone who had sat beside hundreds of hospital awakenings, immediately leaned closer. "Sophia," Claire said gently, "can you hear me?" Sophia's lips moved faintly. Her father was at her side within seconds. She blinked through the blur of medication and pain, focusing slowly on Jonathan's face. "Dad." Jonathan gripped her hand carefully. "You're safe." Sophia's breathing hitched as memory returned, not the crash first, but the folder. Her eyes widened. "The files," she whispered. Jonathan stiffened. Sophia swallowed through dryness and forced the words out in fragments. The blood drive, Harbor Light, fake media contracts, publicity, spending hidden under outreach. Victor Langston signed off on all of it. Rachel Dunn, standing near the foot of the bed, went completely still. Sophia's voice grew steadier despite the weakness. "The drive was real," she said. "People really came to help. But some of your staff used it to bury campaign image contracts inside the charity budget." Jonathan stared at her, every piece of the larger truth finally aligning. The charity itself had mattered. Lives would still be saved. But people inside the campaign machinery had exploited that goodness for political optics and financial manipulation. Not everyone in the system had been honest. The corruption subplot that Sophia had nearly died exposing now sat between father and daughter like a second wound. Down the hall, Malik slowly stood from the donor chair, preparing to leave once cleared by staff. He did not know the full details of what Sophia had revealed, only that something larger than a single act of prejudice had been moving beneath the hospital's polished campaign message. Yet what mattered most to him had already happened. A life had been pulled back from the edge. As he reached for his jacket, Emily stepped hesitantly into the doorway, eyes red but voice controlled. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped. No apology yet. Not here. Not now. The weight of it was still too fresh, too raw, too real. Malik gave her a quiet glance, then nodded once. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement. Sometimes that was the beginning. The chapter closes with Jonathan standing beside Sophia's hospital bed, the folder of corruption evidence now placed in Rachel's hands, while in the recovery wing, Malik prepares to leave in silence, having restored a life and unknowingly exposed a truth far larger than blood. The city hears the story. By sunrise, Charleston was already telling the story, not through polished campaign statements, not through the mayor's press office, not through the carefully timed releases Rachel Dunn had once mastered. It began in the oldest way stories survive, through people. A night shift nurse whispered it to a worried husband in the ICU waiting room while handing him stale coffee. That husband repeated it to his sister at breakfast after a church choir rehearsal. By 7 in the morning, the choir director had shared it with half the congregation of St. Matthew's Baptist. By 8, a harbor dock worker mentioned it to the cashier at a corner market on East Bay Street. By 9, mothers discussing school drop-off were repeating the same astonishing line. The mayor's daughter is alive because the black man they turned away came back and saved her. Charleston did what cities always do with truth wrapped in moral shock. It carried it fast. At a small diner near the port, Terrence Cole nearly dropped his coffee mug when he heard 2 longshoremen talking about a donor named Malik Thompson. "That's my boy," Terrence muttered, equal parts pride and disbelief. Across the city, social media posts from hospital visitors and volunteers filled local feeds. No official names had been released yet, but the shape of the story was unmistakable. Humiliation answered by grace. Prejudice answered by sacrifice. And a rare blood type that had turned a quiet working man into the center of Charleston's conscience. By mid-morning, the steps of Charleston General Hospital looked eerily similar to the place where the campaign had first begun. Except this time the atmosphere carried no staged optimism. The autumn sky had cleared into pale blue, sunlight striking the hospital glass with a clean brightness that made everything feel exposed. A press conference podium had been set up at the same entrance, but the mood was different now. Mayor Jonathan Whitmore stepped out first, not in the crisp certainty of a campaign leader, but in the humbled posture of a man who had spent the night learning how fragile image becomes beside truth. His silver hair was neatly combed again, his navy suit immaculate, yet the lines around his eyes had deepened into something more honest. Beside him stood Malik Thompson, dressed simply in a dark jacket and charcoal jeans, his broad frame steady, his face calm, despite the dozens of cameras now turned toward him. He looked profoundly uncomfortable with attention, which only made the crowd respect him more. Behind them stood Dr. Daniel Hayes, and several feet farther back, Sophia Whitmore in a light gray coat over her hospital scrubs, released only briefly for the conference. The bruising near her temple was still visible, and the faint pallor in her face made her appear more fragile than usual, but the clarity in her green eyes had returned stronger than before. Jonathan stepped to the microphone. The crowd fell silent. "Yesterday," he began, voice carrying across the square, "my daughter survived because a good man chose compassion over humiliation." No slogans, no applause line, only truth. He turned slightly toward Malik. "This city owes its gratitude to Malik Thompson, who stepped forward when many would have had every reason to walk away." The words moved through the crowd like a wave. Some people lowered their eyes in shame. Others clapped immediately. A few reporters stopped typing for a second, struck by the bluntness of the admission. Jonathan continued, and this time his tone carried not just gratitude, but accountability. "Effective immediately, Charleston General Hospital will undergo a full ethics review regarding donor screening procedures, and the city will fund mandatory anti-bias education for all hospital-facing public programs." Standing near the side of the stage was Dr. Evelyn Ross, a 53-year-old black woman with close-cropped silver curls, elegant posture, and the reputation of being the toughest medical ethicist in South Carolina. Years earlier, she had built a statewide framework for equitable ER triage after her younger brother died from delayed treatment in a rural county hospital. That loss had turned her into a relentless advocate for procedural fairness. Jonathan had called her personally at dawn, "Doctor." Ross gave a single sharp nod, signaling the review was already underway. The announcement sent a murmur through the gathered staff. Then, in a moment no one had scripted, Emily Carter stepped forward. She had changed out of scrubs into a plain navy blouse and black slacks, as if deliberately removing the shield of her uniform. Her blonde hair was no longer tightly pinned. A few loose strands framed a face that looked raw from lack of sleep and too many tears. She held no notes. For a second, her breathing trembled. Then she looked directly at Malik. "I was wrong," she said, her voice catching in the microphone. "What I did yesterday was not caution. It was prejudice dressed as professionalism." The crowd went completely still. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "I let inherited fear and unexamined bias influence a decision that should have been based only on medicine and humanity. A young woman nearly died because I failed the values I swore to uphold." Her eyes filled. When she turned toward Malik, the vulnerability in her expression made the apology feel stripped of all defense. "I am deeply sorry." There was no sound except the faint clicking of camera shutters. Malik stood silent for a long moment. The memory of the hallway whispers still lived in him. The humiliation was real. The wound had not vanished overnight, but so was the larger truth now unfolding before the city. He stepped closer to the microphone. "I accept your apology." The crowd exhaled almost as one. Malik's voice remained calm, almost gentle. Not because what happened was small. It wasn't. But because if this city is going to become better, then what matters most is what we do after the truth is seen. The line struck with the force of something larger than a single event. In the crowd, church leaders nodded. Teachers exchanged glances. Hospital staff stood straighter. The lesson had grown bigger than pain. Later that afternoon, the corruption subplot broke into public daylight. Rachel Dunn and Sophia released the internal campaign files to Charleston's Independent Ethics Board. The invoices tied Harbor Light Media Strategies and Victor Langston directly to inflated publicity contracts hidden inside the charitable outreach budget. By evening, 3 campaign aides had been suspended pending investigation, including Marcus Bell, a sharply dressed 42-year-old deputy finance director known for his expensive ties and habit of treating public service like corporate branding. Marcus had risen fast in politics because he understood numbers and public mood, but years in image-driven campaigns had slowly hollowed out his sense of ethical proportion. To him, moving money toward narrative support had felt normal. Until now. The exposure turned the story from personal redemption into institutional reckoning. Yet something hopeful was already growing in the space the scandal left behind. Inside a conference room on the hospital's second floor, Sophia sat with Malik and Dr. Hayes around a whiteboard covered in notes. The room still smelled faintly of dry erase markers and coffee. Sophia leaned forward despite her visible fatigue. "If the city really wants to fix this," she said, "we need a community health program that starts where trust is broken." Daniel nodded. Malik, though less accustomed to conference rooms and harbor warehouses, spoke with the same grounded clarity he brought to everything else. People won't come if they think they'll be judged before they're helped. That became the foundation. A real program. Mobile donor clinics, neighborhood education, free health screenings in churches, schools, and rec centers, local ambassadors chosen from the communities themselves. For the first time, the city's healthcare outreach would be built from lived trust rather than campaign optics. Across the hall, Emily met privately with Dr. Evelyn Ross. "I want to help build the training," Emily said, voice steadier now. "Not because I deserve redemption, because I know exactly how these biases hide." Dr. Ross studied her for a long moment. Then she gave another small nod. "Then start by telling the truth about how they were taught." By sunset, Charleston had heard not just the story of a hero, but the beginning of a reform. The chapter closes on the hospital steps once more. Malik standing beside Sophia and Dr. Hayes as plans for a genuine community health initiative begin, while Emily walks inside with Dr. Ross to begin anti-bias leadership training, and the city around them carries a story no campaign office could ever have manufactured. One city, one blood. 6 months later, Charleston woke to a sunrise that felt entirely different from the gray morning that had begun this story. The harbor shimmered beneath streaks of gold and soft rose light. Fishing boats drifting slowly across the water while church bells carried faintly through the cool spring air. Along the streets surrounding Charleston General Hospital, volunteers were already arranging tables, coolers, registration stations, and banners that moved gently in the sea breeze, but this time the first banner people saw did not carry a politician's slogan. It read, "One city, one blood, every life matters." The words stretched across the hospital entrance in deep navy letters, simple and impossible to misunderstand. And beneath that banner stood Malik Thompson. At 24, he looked much the same as the young man who had first walked into the hospital months ago. Tall, broad-shouldered, deep brown skin glowing in the morning light, close-cropped black hair, calm, dark eyes. But something fundamental had changed in the way the city now saw him. He was no longer the quiet warehouse worker people overlooked in passing. He had become the official public face of Charleston's health outreach campaign, not because he chased recognition, but because his integrity had earned a trust no public relations team could manufacture. He wore a Navy campaign jacket with the new City Health Initiative logo stitched over the chest, though the humility in the way he carried it made it seem less like status and more like service. Children waved when they saw him. Older church women greeted him by name. Dock workers from the harbor slapped his shoulder with pride. The line of donors had already stretched around the block. Black, white, Asian, Latino, young college students, retired veterans, mothers with teenagers, teachers still carrying coffee, firefighters in uniform, nurses off shift. No one looked around wondering whose blood belonged where. The only question anyone asked was whose life might need it next. Near the registration station stood Sophia Whitmore, fully recovered now. The bruising from the crash long gone, but the clarity it had brought her still visible in every decision she made. She wore a cream blazer over a pale blue blouse, her chestnut blonde hair falling softly around her shoulders, green eyes bright with purpose. The experience had sharpened her into something stronger than skepticism. She had become an architect of trust. Over the past 6 months, Sophia had worked side by side with Malik in churches, recreation centers, and neighborhood schools, helping build the city's mobile donor education program. What had begun as gratitude had slowly deepened into a quiet closeness. It was not dramatic, not spoken in sweeping declarations, but it lived in the way they moved around each other naturally, anticipating needs, finishing each other's thoughts during community meetings, and sharing long, late-night planning sessions over takeout coffee and stacks of outreach notes. That subtle emotional thread had become one of the gentlest lines in Charleston's healing. At the far side of the entrance, Daniel Hayes stood with a group of EMT supervisors beside one of the city's new emergency response vehicles. Tall and composed as ever, Daniel now oversaw Charleston's Emergency Modernization Initiative, a program launched directly from the lessons learned the night Sophia nearly died. New trauma transport protocols, rare blood rapid access systems, and cross-county helicopter coordination had all been upgraded under his leadership. Beside him, Captain Melissa Vaughn, a 38-year-old white female paramedic coordinator with an athletic build, cropped brown hair, and the no-nonsense decisiveness of someone forged by years in disaster response, reviewed response time metrics on a tablet. Melissa had lost her husband in a rural ambulance delay years earlier, a tragedy that made her ruthless about emergency logistics and deeply committed to Daniel's reforms. Together, they had reduced Charleston's trauma blood response time by nearly 40%. Inside the hospital lobby, another transformation had taken root. Emily Carter, once the woman whose hesitation nearly cost a life, had become the hospital's strongest advocate against bias in patient and donor access systems. She now led monthly workshops under Dr. Evelyn Ross's ethics program, standing in front of new nurses and volunteers with a humility that made every lesson harder to ignore. This morning, Emily wore pale blue scrubs again, but the woman inside them had changed. Her blonde hair was pinned simply, her expression open rather than guarded. The sharpness once mistaken for professionalism had softened into something wiser. At the volunteer orientation table, she addressed a group of first-time hospital staff. "Bias rarely arrives announcing itself," she said evenly. "Sometimes it sounds like caution, sometimes it feels like instinct. Your job is to challenge it before it harms someone." No one in that room doubted the truth behind her words. Near the courtyard fountain outside the hospital, a small ceremony unfolded before the official start of the drive. Sophia stepped to the microphone holding a framed certificate. Beside her stood Malik, visibly surprised. She smiled at him, then addressed the crowd. Today, Charleston launches the Denise Thompson Memorial Scholarship, awarded each year to students entering nursing, emergency medicine, and public health, especially those committed to serving underrepresented communities. A murmur of emotion moved through the donors. Malik's breath caught. For a moment, the noise of the event disappeared, replaced by the memory of his mother's photograph on the refrigerator and the promise he had once made in the quiet loneliness of his apartment kitchen. Sophia turned toward him. "Your mother's story changed this city," she said softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "Her memory deserves to keep saving lives, too." Malik looked at the scholarship plaque, his usually steady composure touched by visible emotion. The loss that had once lived in him as pain had now become something living, generative, beautiful. Not absence. Legacy. A few feet behind the crowd, Mayor Jonathan Whitmore watched the ceremony unfold. He still wore tailored suits. He still carried himself with practiced dignity, but Charleston no longer saw him merely as a politician. Over the past 6 months, his public image had transformed through action rather than messaging. He had cooperated fully with the ethics investigations, removed every compromised campaign aid, redirected discretionary city funds into healthcare equity programs, and voluntarily placed Dr. Evelyn Ross's ethics board in permanent oversight of public hospital partnerships. For the first time in his career, reform had replaced performance. The city noticed, not because he said the right things, because he had finally started doing them. As a blood drive officially opened, the line surged forward with warmth rather than spectacle. A young Asian American teacher rolled up her sleeve beside a retired black firefighter. A Latino father donated while his teenage daughter filled out volunteer paperwork. A white church pastor arrived with half his congregation. No one whispered about acceptable blood. That old language had no place here anymore. At the mobile donor education booth, Malik and Sophia worked side by side greeting families. At one point, their hands brushed while reaching for the same clipboard, and both paused for the briefest moment. Sophia smiled first. Malik smiled back. There was something quietly hopeful in it. Not a dramatic ending, but the beginning of a partnership built on truth, service, and mutual respect. As the sun climbed higher over Charleston Harbor, its golden light spilling across the hospital steps and the long line of donors waiting patiently beneath the banner, Malik stepped back for a moment to take it all in. The city, the people, the healing, the life where humiliation had once stood. He thought of his mother. For years, her memory had lived inside him as grief sharpened into discipline. Now, standing beneath the banner, one city, one blood, every life matters, he finally understood what that pain had become. Purpose. And for the first time since losing her, the memory no longer hurt more than it healed. It gave back. The chapter closes with Malik smiling toward the harbor sunrise as Charleston's annual blood drive begins in full unity. Sophia beside him. Emily leading fairness from within. Dr. Hayes modernizing lives behind the scenes, and Denise Thompson's legacy living on in every donor who steps forward. Happy ending message. Sometimes the blood people fear is the very blood that saves the ones they love. Humanity has no color, and compassion is the only legacy worth leaving behind. Sometimes the deepest wounds in life do not come from open cruelty, but from the quiet assumptions people carry without questioning them. This story reminds us that in everyday life, the way we treat others in small moments matters more than we realize. A word, a hesitation, a judgment, or a silent act of kindness can shape someone's dignity forever. The blood that was once rejected became the very reason a life was saved, teaching us that humanity has never belonged to race, status, or appearance. In our daily lives, we should learn to pause before judging, listen before assuming, and choose compassion even when pride tells us to walk away. The educational lesson in this story is simple but powerful. Prejudice often survives not through hatred but through habits left unchallenged. Families, schools, workplaces, hospitals, and communities all become better when we teach fairness, empathy, and equal human worth. Real character is revealed not when life is easy, but when someone has every reason to turn away and still chooses to do what is right. Malik's choice teaches us that true strength is moral courage, and true leadership begins with accountability. At the same time, this story gently challenges all of us to reflect on our own lives. Have we ever stayed silent when someone was treated unfairly? Have we allowed stereotypes, fear, or inherited opinions to guide how we see people? Have we overlooked the quiet heroes around us simply because they did not fit our expectations? Growth begins the moment we are honest enough to confront those questions. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still needs to believe that compassion can change a city, a family, and even a generation. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And if you believe kindness can heal what prejudice once tried to break, comment Amen to send this message of unity and hope into the world. Please like this video, subscribe to Stories That Change Lives, and turn on notifications so you never miss another life-changing story. May God bless every person watching today. Protect your family, fill your home with peace, and place compassion in every heart that hears this story. If you are praying for a more loving world, comment Amen below.